So, welcome to this penultimate session in the strand Feminism and its Discontents. The session is called Does Pink Really Stink? Subtitled The Gender-Neutral Parenting Debate. This is a session that is partly about parenting, how we raise children, but also about all the other aspects of gender and how we understand it today. So there's an awful lot of terrain that we can cover, that some of it will be covered by the speakers, and the rest of it you can raise yourselves from the floor. And we've not had a problem with anybody being vociferous from the floor so far today, so I don't anticipate that being a problem for us. So I just want to introduce our speakers in the order in which they'll speak. So we have Nancy McDermott, who's a writer from the US. She's an advisor to the blog Park Slope Parents, which is a strange world in which Nancy inhabited a while, and is known as New York City's most notorious parenting organisation. We have Ros Ball, who's a broadcast journalist and the author of a new book, which I'll wave for her, called The Gender Police, a diary which she's co-written with her partner, which catalogues the instances of gender stereotyping that they've experienced while raising a boy and a girl. Then we have Bea Appleby, who's the editor of The Female Lead, which is an organisation aimed at celebrating female achievement. And she was editor of Girl Talk magazine and launched the hashtag Girls Are Amazing campaign. She's founder of What is Feminism? Author?
Oh, I'm writing it at the moment.
Oh, writing a book called What is Feminism, sorry. What is Feminism? Other Big Questions for Kids, that's due out in May 2016. And then we have Julie Bindell, who's a journalist, author, broadcaster, feminist activist. Some of you will have seen her in a session earlier today on Is the Personal Political. She's also a research fellow at Lincoln University. And then we have Chrissy Daz at the end there, who's a teacher, author and cabaret performer, and he's currently writing a book on gender identity. So just a quick round of applause for our speakers to welcome them in. Right, and over to Nancy.
Right, lots of things to say about this. I have two problems with this. Gender-neutral parenting has been around for a long time, since the 1970s. And at the time, it was really about trying to overcome gender stereotyping that held boys, and particularly girls, back. But what is going on today, I think, is a bit different. And I think what's happened is that instead of gender-neutral parenting being about gender stereotypes, it's actually become about gender norms. So there's a discussion about, biology, and you can do experiments where you can show that things that we think of as typically masculine or typically feminine really change depending on the context. And so people have drawn the conclusion that gender norms are therefore artificial because they're socially constructed, and that they are harmful. And I think this is a mistake, because just because gender norms are socially constructed doesn't necessarily mean that they're a problem. They're a problem if they limit people, but there's actually a very rich content to things like girlhood, boyhood, motherhood, fatherhood. And so I think it's a mistake to just try and say that this is a problem. And it's actually got to the point where it's not only that parents will say you can play with a doll if you want to, which of course is fine, but there's a real reluctance to enforce any kind of gender norms. So, who am I to say what gender my child is? My child will decide their gender. And so, you have people who actually keep the gender of their children secret, so that eventually their child will come out and decide what gender they're going to be. The other problem is that it's one thing if this was just between parents and kids, but this is something that is not between parents and kids anymore. It's something that has become more public and almost a kind of a dogma that people are expected to adhere to. So Target gets rid of its boys and girls departments for toys and then for clothing, and it starts this kind of expectation that all people should do that. What kind of monstrous organization wants to have a label that says boy toys and girl toys? So it takes on a life of its own. And it's actually, even to the point where this is something that is being developed as a curriculum for schools. The EU has a gender neutrality project. And so there's a real move by officialdom to get rid of those gender norms as if they were something very pathological. And I think there's a number of problems with that, but we can discuss that later.
Ros?
So that's interesting what Nancy has said, because I don't recognise very much that suggestion that gender neutrality is somehow becoming some sort of norm. I think it's really, really far from the truth. After I had children, I spent a lot of time being angry, and not with the kids, with the world, because things suddenly looked really different to me. It was like seeing the world with fresh eyes, and what I saw was that nothing seemed fair or equal between my daughter and my son. I always knew that I was going to find the pink and blue divide quite difficult, but I just wasn't prepared for quite how angry it made me. It was in Christmas of 2010 that my partner gave me this battered second-hand 80s book, which is called There's a Good Girl by Marianne Grabrucker. And it was a book that made it all make sense for me. So Marianne was a lawyer in Germany, and while on maternity leave, she had a really simple but brilliant idea. She would write down every day the way her daughter was being stereotyped. And this record was the evidence I felt I needed that no one really talked about. Contrary to what Nancy says, I feel people say that they do treat boys and girls differently. I think they don't admit that they're doing it, though. They think they're treating them the same, but really they're not. So we all know writing things down can be cathartic, so it seemed totally natural for me and my partner to follow in Marianne's footsteps and start keeping a diary as well on a daily basis. And there were so many things we noticed once we started to write it down. It was amazing once we pinpointed in on it how every single day there was something. So, for example, on the 11th of February 2011, my daughter was about 3, or just turned 3. I wrote, "Our daughter played at a friend's house today. They had a lovely morning playing dressing up. He had a hat and said he was a doctor. She had a cape and said she was a princess. Only on Tuesday at the hairdresser's was it confirmed to her that being a princess was something she should really want to be. Adults have spoken to her about being a princess many more times in her life than being a doctor. I wonder what her male friend's choice of dressing up character is influenced by. I'll take note when our boy is old enough to dress up, but I'm guessing no one will have told him he looks like a princess on a regular basis." And on the 11th of January 2011, being shown round her new nursery, a member of staff said to our daughter, "This is what we call the boys' corner. It's a play table for cars." So it became a part of our daily life to take note and write it down, and it amazed us how much adults and children wanted to force our kids to stick to the gender rules, like they were policing each other. When our kids had been born, people had said to us, "Oh, you'll see, you can treat them just the same, but they will still act differently. It's in the genes." I don't believe it is. And keeping a diary was the thing that showed me that in everyday life, there's so many things that shape our children's understanding of being girl or boy. And it was from day one, there was no time for our children to display innate behaviour because they were being treated differently from the start. Different coloured cards we got when they were born, the toys they were given, the clothes they were given were different, the language people used about them was different. There's evidence to show adults handle children differently and, of course, direct them to different toys depending on their gender, although those adults can be unaware they're doing it. And I have specific examples of times when that happened to my children. But because many adults can't see this going on in front of their noses, they bemoan the fact that they've tried to bring boys and girls up just the same, but still see them develop this stereotypical behaviour and use this as evidence that the differences are innate. But our children's experience is made up of so much more than just the words of their parents, and that's the reason I believe it's impossible to gender-neutral parent, because to bring up your child with no concept of gender, you would have to ask the entire world to agree to your plan. And I have called the Daily Mail and asked them if they would get on board with that, but Paul Dacre is not returning my calls. Newspapers froth with outrage when presented with the story of a family who won't reveal their child's gender. and they suggest this is tantamount to brainwashing their child, as though the rest of children are being brought up in some sort of vacuum where their parents don't exert any influence on them. These benign parents are referring to are ones who would never buy their sons any clothes in pink, would never send them to ballet classes, and tell him not to throw like a girl. Do you think that boy is being brought up without any influence? What do you think is his view of girls? So, which finally brings me to the question, does pink stink? Not to me, but sadly it does to those boys I'm talking about, because our culture teaches them very early on to be ashamed in any way to be like a girl. And I have many examples of it in my diary, and the importance we culturally attach to colour and the way children pick that up, and in the case of my children from as early as 18 months, has become a way of widening the gap between girls and boys even further, as far as I'm concerned. And with this, there's a million tiny things that shape their understanding of what it is to be girl or boy, and so I think the building blocks of gender inequality are built.
B, yes. Well, I'm coming from this from a slightly different position as someone who worked in children's media and created media for children. I worked for 10 years in girls' magazines, and I was editor of Girl Talk for 5 years. And the magazines I worked for conformed very much to a traditional idea of what it means to be a girl. Everything was pink or purple, and our content was mainly about fashion and beauty and celebs and cute animals. And every issue we had a gift, which was either a beauty product or a fashion accessory. And even as the editor of this magazine, I didn't really have much control, because my bosses wanted the magazine to sell, as we all did, and to them that meant maintaining the girly girl status quo. I would send my front cover to the publisher for their approval, and they'd literally come back with comments like, not girly enough, or add more flowers. Initially, though a feminist, I thought that this was kind of harmless. But during my 10 years of working in children's media, I saw things change. And curiously, even though every year there were more and more products for girls to buy, thematically the products were really narrowing. And they were just reduced to fashion, beauty, cooking, and all within this pink colour scheme. And the other trend was that products that had once been gender neutral, like Lego, were suddenly gendered. And in fact, there were no limits to the absurdity of the gendered products that were on the market. For example, Pritt Stick for girls, a pink glue, because obviously you have to have a pink glue if you're a girl. And the other really pernicious evolution was that characters from the 80s that I had played with, like Strawberry Shortcake, Rainbow Bright, and Polly Pocket, were redesigned for the 21st century and were slimmed down and made sexy. Even My Little Pony, which is a pony, became sexy. Whereas in the 80s, it was like, broadly speaking, it was a pony, but pastel coloured. Yeah. You played with it in a stable, but in 2015, it's now a sexy pony with these kind of come-to-bed eyes, and you play with it in a fashion boutique for ponies. So the girl world became hyper-girly, and then the boy world was the same, became hyper-masculine. And so the divide was just getting bigger, and the spheres of interest were getting much smaller, and it didn't seem as harmless to me anymore. And then I was reading loads all the time about the problems for young people and eating disorders and mental health issues, and I realised that the magazine I was working on was really part of the problem. But on the positive side, we had a platform from which we could create some change. So we did a survey of our readers to find out their views on their lives, and we found some really dispiriting but quite predictable results. So the girls reading our magazines all wanted to have jobs in show business. Their role model was Katy Perry, and we asked them how they would like to be described, and they said pretty, funny, and kind. And the alternative words that we'd offered them were clever, strong, and brave, which they weren't interested in. So I chose to make some changes to the magazine and tone down the girliness and start a campaign called Girls Are Amazing. But it was very difficult to make these even quite small changes, and my publishers were very nervous about the negative impact this would have on sales. There was some success in this. We did manage to get some stuff through. In the end, I left, and I'm now working on the female lead, which has similar objectives about showing girls the breadth of women's achievement. But so my position on this debate is that actually, despite living in a society that aspires to equality, over the last decade, gender divisions for children have become much more extreme. And I don't think that we need to be completely gender neutral. There are differences between boys and girls, but what is damaging is how exaggerated those differences are being presented to them and how limiting that is. It limits their aspirations and it limits their identities, and those who don't fit into those limited gender ideals feel inadequate. Girls are taught that being pretty is everything, and if they aren't dainty and girly, then they feel ugly. And boys are learning that strength means domination and that they have to hide their emotions, and none of that is really very healthy. So I just think we all need to be more aware of how this shapes boys and girls, and not just parents, but all take responsibility in the media, people who make products for children, and because it's so weirdly out of date. That's the other thing. It's actually really out of step with the adult world as well. And there are positive changes happening, like Hamleys removing the gender separation in stores and campaigns like Pink Stinks. And actually just today, there are new guidelines being published on Tuesday about making sexist language unacceptable in schools. So you won't be able to say man up or call someone a sissy. And teachers are being actively encouraged to steer girls towards boys' subjects and boys towards girls' subjects, like science for girls and languages for boys, all based on research showing that these differences at GCSE and A-level contribute to the gender pay gap. So I think there's progress, but what we really need to do is start making differences early in children's lives, so while they're forming their identities, so that they're really free to express themselves and to follow any ambition they desire.
Julie?
Well, I'm a radical feminist, and the bedrock of radical feminism is that gender is a social construction and not innate. So it's pretend, it's made up. There are gender rules. I won't call them roles because that suggests some kind of benign playing. But women, girls and women, are the victims of gender rules, and men and boys are empowered by gender rules and have more privilege by gender. So it's not a neutral or even playing field for me. And I thought it was really interesting what Bea said about how backwards we've gone, because, of course, in the 1970s, when I was growing up, being bullied at school, being called a slag, and I'll get back to that later, there's a bit more about me being a slag in about the 4th minute. The lesbians were butcher than the straight men, because straight men were doing all the long hair and wide flares and doing a little bit of gender bending, and that was not an accident. We know fashion is never an accident. It's always linked to social and cultural phenomena. It was, of course, because of gay liberation being so focused on ending sexism as a joint project. So gay men recognised that homophobia, as it came to be called, was really as a result of them being not real men, which came straight out of sexism, which comes immediately from the notion that girls in relation to boys are lesser, weaker, etc., etc. You know all the stereotypes, so I won't go into them. My brothers, I have 2 brothers, one older, one younger, they had more freedom and fun than me, so I acted a little bit more like them, which got me into real trouble. Today, I would possibly be sent to a gender identity clinic and would start on the road to becoming transgender to correct me, so that I go from a badly behaved girl who didn't follow the rules to a properly behaved boy, all rough and tumble. But of course, it was simply because boys had a much better time in the 70s. It wasn't because I was necessarily moving towards any kind of sexual or gender identity. But it was amazing how quickly the boys and some of the girls at school stopped calling me a slag and started calling me a lesbian or a leser. And I weighed it up and I thought, and I looked at the boys around me in my school and I thought, it's much better to be a leser. And so that was my initiation into my very proud sexual identity. And I think that nothing entrenches gender rules than girls being called slags. And, of course, the fear and the reality of sexual violence, sexual harassment in the playground. I don't want to overcome gender stereotypes. I want to overcome gender. It has no place in a society where we're striving for the liberation of women and girls and for equality, real equality between women and men. I think that, the notion that we can keep children's gender secret is actually means we keep children's sex secret. Gender and sex are used interchangeably, and there is an absolute concerted effort by some anti-feminists that many people who aren't anti-feminists pick up, which is to confuse sex and gender very willfully. So we now have this crazy notion that gender is something that we're born with innately, and that we have a girl brain that develops into a women's brain, and that sex is somehow something that is fluid and floating all over the place and doesn't have any material reality. And the opposite is true. So we need to, when we say gender, we need to absolutely mean gender as a social construct, as a set of rules, as something that's imposed. And that sex is a biological reality that doesn't have to mean destiny. And I also would disagree with the notion that it's from the child's birth that this socialisation begins. It's actually from the fetus. And we've all seen, even on quirky, lovely programmes that I watch regularly, 24 Hours in A&E, or that one with the babies,
every minute,
which is great. And literally, you know, I mean, a lot of the men there are shown as completely useless. But what they do is that they have a look at the scan at 5 months or whenever or nearer the birth. And I've heard loads of them comment on the size of their son's penis as a fetus. Oh, takes after me there. What, you mean because he's hung like a Tic Tac? You know, so that's my view. Gender hurts very, very much. It hurts girls, it hurts women. I don't think men are very well served by the stereotypes that you have to live up to, and that you're constantly being policed and punished by other men for not actually adhering to those rules as much as you should. And I would like to see an end to it.
Chrissy's turn.
I think one thing that we're probably all in agreement on this panel is that gender identity has nothing to do with an innate thing. I think we're probably all in agreement on that. I want to start off with this apparent paradox that's been pointed out previously, which is that I think it would be fair to say that in society today there is less disparity between men and women as adults than at any previous time. You know, there is a lot more gender equality, and in terms of presentation and behaviour, I think there's a lot more sort of convergence than there has been in the past. While at the same time there appears to be, and I will take it that this is true, an intensification of gender in childhood. Now that's an interesting paradox which I'm going to want to come back to. But first I would just like to look at a couple of different responses to gender in childhood. The first one, which is what we call gender conservatives, which is essentially a bit old-fashioned now and on the back foot really, quite nostalgic, but the idea that society needs clear-cut gender roles so that we can have a stable family situation in which to bring up children, and without that society will collapse. That is a fairly well-known sort of position that we're all familiar with. On the other hand, sort of almost opposed to that are the gender liberals, who I think in some ways are rooted in the sort of let it all hang out philosophy from the 1960s. And on the face of it, they are totally for freedom, you know, sort of anyone can be a parent. We don't care if you, in fact, we're going to celebrate gay and lesbian parents, single parents, stay-at-home dads. All of that is brilliant. And children should be free to sort of develop in whatever way that they sort of want to, so they can become very feminine boys. We'll support that, applaud that. If they want to become trans at the age of 6, then brilliant. We'll sort of go out and help them buy a dress and get their nails done and all of that sort of stuff. But underneath that, if you sort of think of this approach to gender in childhood in terms of its practical implications, what that actually amounts to is quite a strong curtailment of individual freedom. So that children, for instance, I mean, in many different ways. So children, for instance, shouldn't be allowed to choose the toys that they want to play with. They should be sort of nudged or even sort of forcibly told, no, you're a boy, you're going to play with that doll. You're a girl, you're going to climb that tree. And also in terms of clamping down on unsupervised play. So if the boys and the girls are allowed to play freely, there's possibility the boys might all gang up. They might bully the more effeminate boys. They might exclude the girls. So in practice, what this amounts to is less freedom, not more of it. Another thing I think a problem with this approach to childhood gender is that it misunderstands what childhood agency is all about. Because I don't want to say that children are miniature adults. We have agency, we have free choice, and children are the same as us. It's not quite like that, because children, they are at the centre of their socialisation. They are not passive recipients of what society says you should be. They actually are at the forefront most of the time in embracing gender. They are the gender police, not the adults, not the media, not the mean toy maker capitalists. It is one example from Roz's book, for instance, where I can't remember if it was your daughter or another girl who observed that a boy went to the hairdressers and then said, "Oh, hairdressers are for boys." So this is an example of children actively seeking out gender, because children, they are free agents, but their agency is designed towards becoming. So they like broad, extreme categories, because they're only just learning to become self-aware, to understand how to make sense of the world. The third problem is that childhood actually is a phase. What happens to you when you're 4, 6, 8, 12, whatever, is not going to determine the rest of your life. So it is true, fewer girls go into engineering than boys do, but that's not because they weren't allowed to dress up as Spider-Man and play with trucks. It is a response to what's going on in adolescence, in early adulthood, that sort of thing. Now, to get back to the paradox, if it's true that girls are more feminised, boys are more masculinised today than they were previously, I think that actually it's not a paradox, because children actively search for the most extreme archetypes they can find. So in the past, girls and boys were brought up with a very clear sense of what masculinity, femininity meant, because it was there, it was everywhere. It was the basis of how family was organised. Little girls were sort of apprenticeship mothers, and little boys were expected to help the dad to sort of fix the car, that sort of thing. That's gone now. So children are searching out for the most extreme or the most clear-cut cases that they can find. So they want to be princesses. Boys want to be superheroes, because this is the land of fantasy. The real world, when childhood comes to an end, that phase tends to go. Insofar as gender persists into adulthood, it is not that it's not determined by what happened to you as a child. It is a response to the social realities you encounter as you find them. So as adults, we begin to transcend gender, and that is what we need to focus on.
Brilliant. That sets us up really nicely. I'm not going to speak because I've already spoken. So I'm going to throw it out to the floor.
Yeah, so really, I think Julie pinpointed the sexist comment she made just then really sort of summed up.
Which sexist comment?
The one about mocking men for penis size. I think that was the one
I was reporting on sexism.
No, but the joke was at the expense of men, and everybody laughed because it's okay to laugh at men and about penis size. That's an acceptable thing to do.
I thought that you were laughing at the fact that you measure your child's penis whilst it's in the womb.
Okay.
No, it is acceptable to laugh at men for penis size in the general culture. That is an acceptable thing to do in a way that it would simply, an equivalent, which actually you wouldn't really want to say out loud for women, would actually be, as I say, I wouldn't want to say out loud. That would be the direct equivalent. So what I'm saying there is that, let me say first of all that I really think everybody should be able to define their own place in the world and explore their own aims and ambitions as the content of their personality rather than their trousers, basically. But what I've found in this general kind of conversation, which was expressed very clearly by the reaction to that statement by Julie, and also in that general cultural framework, is, and also I think framed by some of the other people here, is the emphasis always seems to be about how it's primarily a problem for girls, and then we'll add on a bit about the fact that it's actually, okay, boys suffer a bit too. But I think boys are at least as equally policed by gender roles. I mean, for example, to give you some idea, I mean, there's a this girl can getting girls into sport, great, but there's no this boy can to get boys into ballet, for example, or it's much harder for a boy to wear a skirt to school than it would be to wear for a girl to wear trousers to school, or I believe that girls would be far less pilloried for wearing blue than boys would be pilloried for wearing pink. So my problem is that despite, on the face of it, presenting the idea that wanting a sort of a gender or supporting the idea of a gender neutral or not teaching kids to be one thing or the other, actually the emphasis always seems to be about it's really girls who we need to be supporting, and boys seem to be, and there's a blindness to the sexism that boys experience.
Kerry Dingle from Worldwide School of Citizen TV. I have to, can I just say to this gentleman over here, get over it, because it's bad enough that, women are being made out to be vulnerable victims, but when we now have men going, oh, me too, then things are really sad. But my question in relation to this discussion, one thing that worries me from the panel and more broadly on this discussion is that there would seem to me, or an assumption is, that there's a contempt for our peers out there in the world, that somehow they are all going along with this horrific stereotyping of children, and therefore a demonisation of parents to boot. Because, I grew up, maybe I'm Julie's generation, maybe I'm older, I use a lot of dye, and I think we've all turned out to be pretty sane, sensible people, able to decide in this room, all of us, what we think and what we want to be, and to say what we think at a free speech festival. But we somehow think that the public out there are a bunch of numpties who are, if they go into a toy shop with pink toys, if they let their kids wear princess dresses, and I now plan to buy all my nieces' princess dresses because I'm so annoyed, that they're somehow stupid crap people. And I'm worried that there is real contempt for parents and the public here, and we're not a problem, are we? And if we're capable of thinking, so is everyone else.
My question starts with a quotation from my mum's Facebook, so it may be a little bit odd. And so it begins. Small boys are clever and handsome like daddy, and small girls are mummy's best friend. Unless, of course, mummy is too busy being an astrophysicist, or a vet, or a head teacher, or an engineer for such friendships, or simply has wider social aspirations than being friends with a preschooler. Don't get me wrong, my daughter is awesome company, and we have some excellent times together, and I would kill lions with my bare hands to protect her, but she is not my best friend, and I am not hers. I am responsible for her safety and her well-being. I make decisions for her. Sometimes I tell her off. I encourage her to put more fruit and less cake in her packed lunch. Most of all, my job is to make sure she never uses the glass ceiling as a mirror to check her eyeliner in, and encourage her to get on and smash through it. The T-shirts that those quotations come from were for 3 to 6 month-year-olds. So my question to the panel is, do you think that introducing that gender at such a young age harms adults as well as children, and then harms the aspirations that girls especially have for themselves? I understand that it does harm boys as well, in the way that we stereotype boys, but it doesn't necessarily stop them from going on to be what they want to become all the time, whereas I feel for women it may be a bigger social barrier.
I just want to say that I agree with everything that the panel said so far. I describe myself as a feminist. I love maths, science, and I don't cry very often, but because I like wearing makeup, I find it really cool that some days I can just wake up and have blue eyelids or sparkly lips, but because makeup is seen as typically girly girl, I almost feel bad for wearing it because I'm not being feminist if I wear makeup because I'm some little girl with, sparkly lips on. But I don't know, I agree with your arguments, but I feel like sometimes I might actually be limiting myself for stuff that I enjoy doing because I feel like I'm not being boyish enough, if you know what I mean.
I wish I could say that my daughters have been raised without a strong gender input, but
Could you stand up, please? Or I think
it's almost impossible to abstract yourself, and also it's a lot of fun, and they seem to derive a lot of fun from it. It does seem to be like quite difficult to imagine the world without gender. But what I'm really thinking is that I agree with that. It's probably more intense. Maybe this is a marketing thing or whatever. But then that's a problem because all the other social variables would appear to be moving in the opposite direction. What I mean to say is the latest figures on the gender pay gap say 10%. It's a 10% pay gap. When my mother was raising us, women were earning 63% of what men earned. There are as many women with labour contracts today as men. There's a few 100,000 in it. It's not very different. The hours are still not quite the same. The European Values Survey, which has been measuring what men and women think for 40 years, has reported for those 40 years that in their attitudes, in their social attitudes, men and women's attitudes have been slowly coalescing, that the things that they disagreed with most, they've come to agree with more and more. And so all of that I find a bit difficult, because if it's true that gender stereotyping in childhood is so determinative, why is it that as it gets stronger, that its consequences become less? I mean, perhaps there's some other determinants that we're taking into account that we're missing, but it really feels like none of this is actually having the consequence that we would expect it to have. In fact, it would appear to be that putting pink dresses on girls gets them into university. It would appear to be that getting girls to do makeup makes more of them become engineers, because more of them are becoming engineers. All the directions that people are moving in are precisely the directions towards a greater equality, and we're talking about the terrible disaster that's being created by gender stereotyping in childbirth.
I asked my 10-year-old niece the other week why she really, really likes the most hideous pink things. Hideous in my view, but she loves them. And I said, why do you like pink so much? And she said, because it's in your face. And she was wearing pink DM boots at the time and pink fake spectacles. And so, what on earth the semiotics of that pink are, I really, really don't know, other than this kind of very feisty girlhood, which seemed to be the thing that everybody wants to cultivate, which maybe that's problematic as well. Okay, yes.
So my name's Sandy Starr. Funnily enough, my nickname at school was Wendy, actually. I've got 2 points. The example given here of My Little Pony is very funny, because since My Little Pony was revived recently, it's no longer made for a young audience. It's now made for a teenage and adult subculture. Since it was brought back as My Little Pony Friendship is Magic, I think it's called. So now you've got the Brony, which is the adult male My Little Pony fan. You've got the Critical Theory blog, which is called My Little Pomo. It's far from being an example of over-feminized children's toys and cartoons. It's an example of adults becoming unhealthily interested in children's entertainment, and this adult becoming unhealthily interested in adults' unhealthy interest in children's entertainment. So I thought your example, there's a lot more going on, and it doesn't point the way you suggested it did. That's one point. The other point I wanted to make, which follows on from a point that was made over here, is just to ask whether gender-neutral parenting or just this attentiveness to or concern about gender, whether there's something antisocial about it. Chrissy makes some very interesting points about childhood agency, but even if you set that aside, the fact is children will be open to a variety of influences other than yourself. I mean, that's what socialisation means. There are going to be influences over your children over which you have no control and which you might not like, and that's just called parenthood. So is there not a sense in which that's fairly innocuous, or at least a fact that can be dealt with, rather than a subject of grave concern that deserves the sort of attention we're hearing? I'd just be interested in people's thoughts on that.
Okay.
Yeah, I find this quite a difficult debate, because I've got lots of sympathy with the views expressed on the panel. Obviously, I want men and women to have as much freedom and choice as they can. And I had to think about this a bit when somebody from the sort of gender-neutral Pink Stinks movement came into my kids' primary school, and they wanted to do sessions to encourage girls to think about pink and boys to think about pink and question their assumptions. And I think the thing that really kind of bothered me about that, and why I wasn't really in favour of it in the end, is that ultimately, if you start getting children talking about it, you can't really help but reinforce it. You're ultimately making children more conscious of those gender roles, gender stereotypes than they even were before. So I think that's a bit of a problem with this debate. I'm not suggesting that this debate shouldn't take place or anything like that. But ultimately, the more, whatever you do, and I think I've got lots of sympathy with the points that were made by, sorry, I've forgotten your name, the last speaker there, that anything that you do, the more that you kind of say, you know, why don't you play with this doll? Do you really want to climb that tree? Or the other way around. You're just ultimately getting children more and more conscious of it and more aware of it. And I think perhaps also less free than they were before. I think that was a very interesting point that was made. So ultimately, I suppose what I want to say is, can we just stop talking about it and just let them get on with being kids and making their own choices, of course influenced by the culture around them. There's no way around that. Because I do wonder whether it isn't just a little bit superficial. And here I'm kind of pulling in the same direction as points that other people have made. Because I don't really care if my daughter likes princesses or wants to wear a pink tutu or anything like that. What I really care about is that she is strong and independent and knows what she thinks and says what she thinks. And I agree with people that say that more and more women in particular are playing that role in society, and surely that's what matters rather than the colour of their tutus or anything like that.
I'm going to come back to the panel now, then we'll go back out again. Nancy.
I'm just going to say this. I think for kids to gravitate toward one gender or another toys, gender-specific toys in childhood is normal. And that's because kids are trying to find their place in the world. And gender norms exist in all societies, and it's just a starting point. And it's a starting point, and they get over it. But I think most of this discussion is really about adults projecting their preoccupations onto kids. And in my experience, it starts when the careful parents have put together the gender-neutral hipster nursery, and then their daughter gets to a certain age and wants to buy Disney princesses. And the beautiful nursery is spoiled by Cinderella and Snow White, and I was joking with a woman whose daughter had brought a plastic princess book to show and tell that you press buttons and it, the princess talks, and she was humiliated. And she said, "Well, I had all these other books, but she wanted to bring this one." And you might as well have said, "What will they think of me?" I think a lot of this wanting to be gender neutral is actually about parents wanting to be seen to be gender neutral. So, for example, I don't know if anybody followed the story of Mickey Willis, who's a very hip dad in California, whose son wanted to use his store credit to buy an Ariel doll. So, I think most parents would be like, I actually really do think most parents are pretty tolerant, and you want an Ariel doll, that's fine. But you don't do that today. You make a video of it, and you put it on YouTube, and you become an internet sensation. Or you blog about it, and it's like, what I said when my son wanted to wear a dress. And it's not really about the kids anymore. It's about parents projecting their own worries and preoccupations about masculinity and femininity onto little kids.
Ros.
I kind of take that point. So I think, just to go back to your point there, first of all, don't talk to kids about pink. That seems just completely anathema to me, because prohibition just didn't solve anything. Let's not talk about it and then they won't know about it. No, I think for me, the more I talk to my kids about the culture around them, the more they can have an understanding about it and make their own choices, and they may completely reject what I say. And that is fine by me, as long as they've got as much information as possible. Not don't talk to them about it, talk to them about all of it and more, if possible. It was interesting what someone was saying, actually, about... so the guy who was saying more women are becoming engineers, and despite them wearing pink dresses. I think that's interesting because... Previously, I think in the 70s, towards the 80s, toys were much less gendered, if we're talking about toys. I mean, it's not just about stuff. It's really not about stuff. But seeing as that was the point, my problem is not pink. I don't mind pink at all, and my daughter has it, and I don't wish she didn't. The question isn't what's wrong with pink. The question is what's wrong with pink for boys. Why are boys not getting given pink? It's because it's associated with girls, and girls are still seen as lesser. And that is the problem. So, great, happy for my girl to wear the pink tutu, all that stuff. I'd just like my boy to be able to wear the pink tutu as well without being victimised for it, as you know, as someone was saying. I think I'll leave it there for now. Go on.
Thank you. Okay, Julie?
I do have to come back to my friend who called me a sexist. I am one of the few journalists that's written about a support group for men with small penises, I'll have you know. An article that came out. If you Google Bindle plus small penis support group, you'll find it. Anyway, I'm not concerned about pink either. I'm concerned about the kind of toys or activities that girls are railroaded into, which makes them less active, less visible. I'm sorry, I've got a terrible chest infection. And I'm paying for it now. Okay, so I think, of course, that boys are harmed by this stereotyping, but it's the price you pay for privilege. It's the price you pay to have the kind of privilege that you have from every single institution in the land, in the world, everywhere. So yes, it hurts, and ultimately feminism can free you from these gender rules, but you have to play the game. And actually, radical feminists are your best friend, men, because we're the ones that actually have full and total belief in the fact that you were not born bad, and that you are not inherently bad, and that you're not predestined to do terrible things to girls and women. The other thing is about the more women are engineers, and therefore the kind of girls' toys doesn't affect us. Well, it may well be that we're almost paid as much as men. It may well be that glass ceiling, you know, is invitingly close. But I care about the women at the bottom. And I care about the fact that the vast majority of those who are experiencing things like female genital mutilation, forced marriage, rape and sexual assault, domestic violence, sex murder and homicide murder from men are female. And they're statistics that you cannot ignore, because even the World Health Organization, which isn't known as a great feminist organization, will accept that. The majority of women abused in the sex trade, etc., etc. So yeah, we have a bit more emancipation, a bit more equality, but no, we are not anywhere near as close to equality as that particular comment would have suggested.
Thank you. B?
Oh, just to address the point about women being engineers, that's absolutely not true. And actually, in the last 30 years, women doing engineering degrees has dropped. And there was a piece in The Guardian this morning by Martha Lane Fox about the woeful lack of women in tech jobs and how many jobs lie unfilled because women aren't going into them. So that's actually not true. And I think that I really feel that there is a link between girls playing with dolls and never touching a Meccano set and not at an early age developing any interest in stuff like engineering and science. And just the other point about that you made about the sort of contempt that you felt among panels like this for normal people who are parenting. When we launched the campaign that I was talking about earlier, the response from parents was so overwhelmingly positive. And what they talked about was a feeling of powerlessness with this onslaught of very gendered media and, you know, all the toys and products, and that they were just kind of navigating it and they didn't know what to do about it. And seeing someone make a change and try and combat that, they really liked. So I don't feel that kind of contempt.
A few years ago, I taught a GCSE course in systems and control, which is a subject which combines electronics and mechanisms. And as you can imagine, this was an option that children could choose. As you can imagine, it was mostly boys who chose that. And I did at the time, I used to fret and think, well, what could I actually do to make this more appealing to girls? Maybe paint the tool handles pink or something like that, and maybe that would help. But ultimately, girls didn't choose that option because that was the choice they made. They have a choice and they don't go into engineering. I don't think it's because they have been indoctrinated that this is a boys' thing. I think that it's more of an immediate response. They recognise there's going to be more boys doing this than girls. Therefore, I don't want to be the only girl in a classroom full of boys. Okay, it's a problem. You know, do we make all subject compulsory? Do we say to girls, no, you've got to do engineering because there's not enough women in it? On My Little Pony, I believe My Little Pony is a horse. When I was a child, a horse was things that cowboys and soldiers rode around in. So how it became a girls' thing, I'm not really sure. I think we have to, basically, the main thing we have to remember is children and adults are completely separate spheres. They're different worlds. Teenagers occupy a different world as well. Throughout childhood, we are sort of learning different things. There are things that you learn that you then learn the opposite. There was a famous book in the 1970s, Learning to Labour, how working class boys get working class jobs. Do we teach children from a young age to be boys and girls so that they will then become men and women and fulfil stereotypical roles? No, I don't think that's true. I think that in children learn a lot of stuff. They don't learn how to be a boy or a girl and how to then to become a man or a woman. They learn lots of stuff and they utilise that stuff. The resources we give to children is what's important, not the way we push them one way or another.
More hands, please.
It seems that the phase between childhood and adulthood is a blur, and when the reality is that the phase of adolescence, I think, is the most difficult to get through, because you begin to get past all the you should be doing this because you're a girl, or you should be doing that because you're a boy, and you actually discover who you are, and you can decide what you want to do and what you want to be, and if you want to choose a gender, what you want to be. And I don't really think that gender neutralisation can be achieved simply because of the way society has been in the past. My question to the panel is, what do you think parents or people in general should be doing should be focusing on so their children can be brought up to feel like that they are comfortable with themselves, whether they decide to be a girl or a boy, and within themselves.
Also, sort of on the question of adolescence, because you've all talked about younger children and not so much about adolescents. I'm on a parent council, and almost every month we have a discussion, usually raised by the teachers, but also raised by concerned parents, about how girls are bunking off PE. And somebody said girls are less active. One of the panel said girls. I mean, I think this is a very interesting thing to think about, and I've thought about it. And I think the reason that girls are less active, I think there probably is evidence to suggest that they are less active, that they bunk off PE more than my generation, is possibly because as adolescents, they're very much a product of a culture in which we constantly give them permission to feel vulnerable and to feel like they can take the easy option on things. And for the panel that argued that we needed to get rid of gender stereotypes, is it possible that it's an unintended consequence of feminism that we're educating young adolescent women to be feeble?
Kind of along the vein of what's been said with adolescents in schools, from my personal experience and some of my friends, we've seen that in mixed schools, girls veer more towards subjects such as drama and art and humanities, kind of starting from when we have to select for GCSEs then to A-level. And boys tend to be more scientific with maths and science and PE subjects. However, in single-sex schools, there's far more of an even spread, with more girls and more boys doing drama and art and science and maths. But my question is the separation of genders within school at an early age good because it makes it easier for children to do what they want, or does it enforce the strict gender roles even further?
I had a point which probably relates more to what Chrissy was saying. So Chrissy, you made a distinction between childhood and adulthood. So it doesn't really matter what children choose in childhood because that's a separate sphere from adulthood. I guess my question is, isn't part of the problem that sexism is not just sexist, it's also patronising and infantilising? And so that kind of belies the definition. When you talk about, for example, rape culture, I wasn't in the talk this morning, but I imagine this is something that came up. A lot of the response to that that's sexist is also infantilising because it says, well, the way to solve that is by women not going out at night or whatever those things there. So I feel like there's a link there that belies the distinction you're trying to make.
This is a quick one, for Chrissy again. The fact that you spoke, it was just upon your last point that you believe that we just completely don't, insert any stereotypes or anything. I think, of my personal experience, I have never, before the start of this year, thought about there could be any fluidness between gender. Since I read a very interesting book by Emma O'Toole just a couple of months ago. And does that not show that we completely force gender stereotypes? Because I know many people around me, we never think about breaking these boundaries. And the fact that there are boundaries in the first place, not just due to our bodies, but how we act, kind of proves, I think, that there are stereotypes involved that we have set in. Because I never once thought about it. But now that I've heard, for instance, here today, more views from more people, it just opens up doors that were once closed.
The debate is very bizarre to me. I mean, it sounds as if there's a lot of big political issues that have been miniaturised and ridden into the nursery on the back of a My Little Pony. And it's as if we're using the safe space of a nursery or playroom to discuss much bigger issues that belong elsewhere in the adult political world. And I just wonder if that is because that bigger adult political world isn't really there. I'm also concerned that this is just another vehicle for interfering with family life, telling parents what to do, guilt-tripping them. And there's too much of that around anyway.
I'm a woman in engineering, and when I was at school and at sixth form, no one ever suggested to me that I should think about a career in engineering. And it was only very shortly before I applied for my degree in civil engineering that I even knew what an engineer did. I had no idea. So, fair enough if girls don't want to do engineering, but I think that they should at least be well informed and know what an engineer does. So how do you propose that we get more girls into STEM subjects? Because what I feel at the moment, at least at university level, the approach is workshops to help girls overcome their low self-esteem and confidence or build assertiveness, which I think actually cements those stereotypes and actually is a bit backwards.
I think introducing a child to a certain thing at a young age will not necessarily influence them because it depends on the child's environment growing up from that point on. Like, for example, this is just me, but when I was younger, I wasn't properly introduced to physics, but I'm an aspiring astrophysicist. And children learn what they like differently. And I think the problem with gender-neutral parenting, going on to what you just said, I think we should stop telling people what to do with their children. I think it's up to the parents and the children to agree on what the child likes, and it's up to the parent what to buy the child. And I think it's kind of, in a sense, it's bringing shame to girls who want to actually grow up and act girly and want to go out and want to wear short skirts and makeup. And it's fear that children might actually grow up to actually have a gender and actually want to have a gender identity.
To the point where you're saying gender expectations enforced in childhood don't affect adolescence and when you're picking your university options and things. I think they do, because when I was a child I was pushed towards dressing up like a princess, whereas my twin brother was virtually told he could be anything. And then you look at university options, and a lot of the things that I've I'm finding I could do for university, I've never been told to think about, whereas my brother was always encouraged to think about. And I think what you're saying about how gender, like, stereotypes, I think if you do enforce them as a child, I think they can affect, like, adolescents and adults, because it limits their options and what they're told they can do.
So you're doing a degree in princessing, or?
Hi, I'm sort of going back to something you said at the start about sensationalisation. And I'm just thinking, I know people have said that it should become like the norm, and that's the way we have to get over these things, by making these things the norm. And they said it in the last debate about sort of breastfeeding in public. But when you think about big change that's happened, such as, I mean, women getting the vote from the suffragettes, they were complete, like, sensations, weren't they? Like, throwing themselves in front of horses. And I just think sometimes sensationalisation is actually a good thing to progress for the change to become a norm, as it should be.
That's it from you lot. Back to this lot. This is your final comments, by the way, so just,
Okay.
just
All
over
right.
a minute each, I'm afraid.
If you leave this room with nothing, leave it with this thought. Little boys do not think pink stinks because they hate women or they think little girls are lesser. They think pink stinks and they say they hate boys or they hate girls because they want to belong to a group of boys. It's about them self-identifying. And little boys who say that they don't like girls, they hate girls, are not misogynists any more than little girls who say they hate boys are misandrists. I mean, I just think it's just astounding how we project our own preoccupations with masculinity on particularly onto little boys. I don't think it's true that little boys are not a focus of this. I think little boys right now are the main focus of this. In fact, there's a new film out, which you can see on Amazon apparently, called The Mask You Live In, where the premise is that boys are kind of brutalized into being hyper-masculine when they reach age 14. And it's interesting because they just did a showing of this in my old neighborhood. And so all of these mothers of boys are saying, you know, I talked to my son about this, and he says he hasn't experienced this. And this, you know, it happens over and over again. And they say, our boys must be the lucky ones. You know, not that, you know, perhaps this isn't really what's going on. So I think we have to be extremely careful about projecting adult concerns onto kids, which is another point about toys. I mean, I phoned up the Toy Association, and I sent them a picture of my Barbie dream house and the current Barbie dream house, and I said, what is going on? Why is this so pink? Why are you doing this? And basically they said, well, you know, you see pink, we see bright colors. When we design toys for kids, we take our inspiration from what adults are doing. And it's interesting because if you go and you look at when the real pink princessy trend started, it was around the time that in the 70s women had entered the workforce. And I don't know if anybody remembers Dress for Success or Power Suits. I mean, women entered the workforce permanently, and and they dressed like men. It was you were expected to kind of masculinize yourself, and there was a backlash where adult women were like, no, I don't want to wear power suits. I want to, just wear what I want to. So I think that toys are influenced more by what adults do, and it's not, it's not necessarily. Well, it's not a plot. It's not a I don't know, some sort of. I don't think anybody's saying it's a gender conspiracy, but and then just I can't speak about the UK, but I just want to tell you, in the US right now, math undergrads are split 50-50 between men and women. Back in 1976, only 8% of PhDs in biology went to women. Today, it's 44%. Half of medical doctors today are women. And in the fields of engineering, physics, chemistry, and math, the doctorates issued to women tripled or quadrupled between 1976 and 2001. So, definitely not 50-50 in every area, but there's definitely change. And just really quickly, I really agree with what Carrie is saying, because it's one thing when your child does kind of conform, is conforms to what's expected of their gender. But I think when you have a boy, particularly a boy, who likes to play with tea sets and dolls, parents are really scared. And they're scared because they have a very cynical and negative view of what people, on the one hand, of how people will treat their kids, but on the other hand, of how fragile their kids are and how they won't be able to handle it. And, I'm not trying to suggest that teasing doesn't go on, but if you talk to people who have been teased and you say, if you could go back and do it again, would you like to, relive your life and not be teased? And people are ambivalent about it because the experiences that you go through, the adversity that you go through makes you who you are. And so I think, that's something that we need to bear in mind is, yes, there can be bad things for people who don't conform, but it's not the end of the world.
Thank you, Nancy. Rose. Pick up what Nancy said and then someone else in the audience about adults projecting onto children. Again, we're kind of thinking, it was something I was trying to explain earlier, where we're trying to imagine that kids live in this vacuum or something. So, apparently we're projecting onto them, but this is assuming that they're not having all the influences. They're surrounded by adults who are talking about lots of different things, all with their opinions on things. And kids are absorbing all that stuff. You can't imagine that they are not being affected by all these things. So suggesting that if I keep my views to myself on gender, this somehow will prevent my child from being brainwashed or something, of course, it's very complex, all the things that children hear from different people and understand. And I'm not about to stop talking about the things that I believe to my children or other children, and I'm sure you're not either. So let's not imagine that childhood is a bubble where they will not have any of these influences. They will, and I'm going to keep talking to them about it. On guilt-tripping parents, which I think has come up a few times, and I just wanted to mention, I know exactly how that feels. God knows I'm not trying to make any parents feel guilty. I'm really, really not. I'm a parent who has felt all those pressures myself, and I genuinely don't want to do that. And I have said, I suppose it was similar to someone saying, saying that parents sometimes have come and said, no, we like the things you're offering to us. We feel overwhelmed by all this culture. And what can we do about it? And I think I come from a similar position, which is that I just want to share some of these ideas. You don't all have to agree with me at all, but the people who do and are interested in that, I want to talk to them about it, and I want to share these ideas, and I don't want to make them feel bad, and I don't want to feel bad myself. I spend a lot of time saying to myself, don't feel bad about that. It doesn't matter that much. Get over it. And I would say the same to them. I don't want to make parents feel bad. One more thing. Is that all right? Sport, which I thought was really important and interesting, because sport's quite specific, actually. Real big differences between girls and boys. So 12% of 14-year-old girls in the UK are reaching the recommended level of physical activity, half the same of boys at that age, which I think is colossal and really, really sad. And a lot of it, I think, is about femininity policing. So, for example, during the Olympics, women weightlifters were really victimised. Oh, you're really masculine, all this sort of thing. Men tweeting them, you look ugly. Right, there was a judo player who just won a gold medal. I remember watching the TV, and the presenter said to her, so what did you do before your match today? And she said, oh, I didn't have time to think of anything. I didn't even wash my hair. And he was like, you didn't wash your hair? Oh, my God. She just won a gold medal. She didn't have time to wash her hair. Of course she didn't. It's about femininity, often with girls not wanting to play sport, and I think there's a real sea change needs to happen there.
Gender is a political tool to keep girls subordinate to men, boys, and of course women subordinate to men. So I want to see an end of it. I'm a gender abolitionist, very, very clearly. It serves no good at all for women and girls. It does privilege men, but you'll be better off with it, as I said earlier. But we are going back to the dark ages with science, and we're going back to such essentialism, to biological essentialism, where we're looking for a gene to explain everything. And this actually has no place at all in progressive politics, because we can find a gene for criminals. Okay, let's not look at class disadvantage. Let's not look at working class oppression. Let's find a gene that would explain any kind of delinquent behaviour. Let's look for a gene to explain why somebody might be gay or lesbian, rather than look at it as a viable alternative to heterosexuality. And let's look for a female brain, for differences in girls' and boys' brains, so we can carry on with this bullshit where we veer girls towards less active, pathetic playtime activity and block anything that might actually give them some kind of confidence and physical strength by punishing them and calling them tomboys or lesbians, both of which are honourable statuses, I have to say. And so I would really like to see an end to the gender essentialism. If we saw an end to gender essentialism, and there's great science, Cordelia Fine's a great scientist who looks at sexist science, then we will eventually see an end to gender.
Thank you. B.
Really quickly, just to address the point about girls being active. I was actually at the launch of the This Girl Can campaign, and they'd done research into why girls were so much less active and women, and the number one reason was judgment from other people. So it's totally tied into women feeling self-conscious about how they look, not wanting to sweat, having people shout at them when they're running. So I think it's really tied to femininity and not about being feeble. And then I'd just like to say that a lot of people have talked today about how childhood is a phase and that what children experience when they're young has no effect on them when they grow up, and that's just completely bizarre to me. They're called your formative years because they're your formative years. Yeah. And so the idea that you can't join the dots between how a woman ends up, from when she's a child is just totally mad.
Totally agree.
They're called your formative years. Doesn't necessarily mean that they are. Well, obviously there's continuity. You don't sort of beam out of one life into another one when you change from being a child to an adult. It's not a sort of extreme. Obviously, we're all the same person, moving on and changing. But the important thing is that a lot of what positions itself as being anti-biological determinism ends up being childhood determinist or social construction theory determinism. It's all forms of determinism, and that's not what we should be focusing on. In terms of the question about how should girls and boys be treated, I was reminded of Mary Wollstonecraft, who's a proper good feminist, not that there aren't others, and the main thrust of her work was that girls should be allowed to be educated in exactly the same way that boys were. It was brilliant. At the time, girls weren't given any kind of education at all, and she suggested in her book that boys get strict discipline. They get beaten when they get things wrong. That's what we want for our girls as well. For the time, actually, that was very progressive. That was very progressive thing to be saying, because this was a campaign against the formal restrictions that society applied against girls. And in terms of advancing women's equality, that's what we need to ask. A few questions. Does it prescribe behaviour? Does it restrict the freedom of others? Does it call on the state? Does it focus on concrete things that could be done? There's still several things that could be done, especially around fertility, free access to the morning after pill, easier abortion, childcare facilities and so forth. These are the sort of things that we need to focus on rather than childhood stereotyping.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, my panel.